Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the panel you've been waiting for, alternative energy, and of course we have an excellent chair, as we have with the prior panels, Mr. Ross Hornby, who is the Vice President of Government Relations and Regulatory Affairs. I got the title all wrong, but
Government Affairs and Policy.
Government Affairs and Policy for GE Canada. And at this time, I'd like to turn the panel or the microphone over to him.
Okay, well, thank you, David. First of all, welcome to the incredible shrinking panel. We were originally going to be 4 up here, and 2 of our panelists actually dropped out because they came down with laryngitis. I'm just recovering from laryngitis, so you'll have to bear with me. But I promise I did not infect them because I only talked to them over the phone, so I don't think they got it from me. But so 2 of our panelists dropped out, and Mark Winfield, Professor Mark Winfield, who's an associate professor at York University in the Sustainable Development Program there, very graciously offered to jump in and speak to us in this panel. And our other panelist is Brent Gilmore, who is the executive director of a little think tank in Canada and advocacy group called Quality Urban Energy Systems for Tomorrow, or QUEST. And I've got to see some of the work that his group does in developing energy strategies in areas where there's a lack of capacity to really analyze some of the issues, both legal, technical, and political, to help them move towards a sustainable energy strategy. I participated in one of his sessions in the Northwest Territories in Canada, and it was really quite instructive. Brent also is a professional planner by background, so I could see that he was very interested in the previous panel. And I think this one that we have is going to build on some of the themes that that group discussed. Essentially, what we're going to look at is pathways that will help clear the way for a more rapid adoption of renewables in North America. And I'll just say a few words. GE, of course, where I work, is one of the biggest providers of renewable energy in North America, or clean energy, certainly in terms of whether it's wind turbines, solar. We're doing a lot of work now on energy storage, which of course will complement solar and wind. We also build the grid integration equipment and the grid monitoring equipment that can stabilize both massive grids, but also distributed power grids as well. And we've had a couple of pilot projects on that, both in Canada and in the United States. And then, in addition, of course, we build smart meters, and then we build energy efficient uses for the electricity system, whether it's in appliances or LED lighting or some of the other monitoring devices that are going to be developed and that you'll be finding eventually both in commercial buildings and residential buildings. So we have a big interest in how renewables fit into the energy picture in North America. And if you look at the legal framework for renewables, it's really remarkably similar all around the world, actually. Essentially, renewables have required some kind of incentive structure or subsidy in order to promote early adoption. And where incentives have existed, there actually has been quite rapid adoption, whether you're looking at Germany or Spain, 2 leaders in the field, or Ontario, or the United States. And the problem has actually been not so much with the incentive structure, but with a lack of stability in that incentive structure. They come and go, and particularly as a result of the fiscal crisis, that came out of the Great Recession, as we call it, so a lot of those incentives were pulled back, and where they were pulled back, we actually saw the adoption of renewables diminish. But certainly, I think people like Brent and Mark, and certainly GE as a company, is looking forward to the day where incentives will not be needed for and direct subsidies for the adoption of renewables. And the reason for that is because of technological advances that are taking place. Originally, incentives were needed because solar panels were expensive and largely unavailable. And then wind turbines were also inefficient and they were expensive. Biofuel was largely unavailable. So you really did have to have an incentive structure in place, and governments around the world actually recognized that and adopted various policies, usually in the form of a feed-in tariff so that the providers of renewable energy got paid a higher price per kilowatt hour. In Ontario, the price was 11 cents a kilowatt hour. It actually started at 14, went to 11, is now moving down to 9. You know, if you look at what's happening in the industry now from a technological perspective, we are now getting bigger turbines. They have longer blades. They're taller. They're built out of different materials increasingly, including composites, and they are their efficiency is moving up. Originally, they had about a 30% efficiency rating. Now we have turbines that GE makes, and some of our competitors as well, that are up to 60% efficiency. And this has brought the cost down, so that in those parts of North America, for example, where the wind blows, like on the Great Plains, what we call the prairies in Canada, you can get wind generation down as low as 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And that is in the range where it becomes competitive even with natural gas. So technology is no longer the barrier to the adoption of renewables. It's really more a combination of legal, regulatory, and local political issues that have held up the adoption of are holding up the adoption of renewables. And there's a bit of a reaction now that has taken place against renewables in very many jurisdictions in North America where local communities don't want wind farms near them. And there's all kinds of concerns being expressed about visual pollution, about noise, about even health concerns, although the government of Canada, the province of Ontario did a health study. The British did a health study on the effects of renewables that concluded that wind farms actually do cause harm to health because people worry about them. But they actually, other than that, they don't. So, I mean, you have to take that seriously because it leads to issues around social license to operate, and that is an increasing concern throughout the entire energy industry, whether it's oil and gas or fracking, like we heard about in an earlier panel, but it's also hit the renewable business. And so there's a great deal of local community concern about wind farms. And then in terms of regulatory barriers, it's increasingly more and more difficult to build wind farms because of various local, state, provincial, sometimes national rules that mean that there are a lot of hoops and hurdles that have to be leapt through before you get approval for a wind farm. And then there is an environmental assessment process that takes usually about a year. It's always subject to appeals, and so it becomes a costly regulatory process to navigate. And sometimes issues around road access, setbacks, construction permits, all end up getting the proponents of wind farms before either regulatory tribunals or courts in reviewing. And there are a myriad of different environmental hoops and hurdles as well that have to be gone through. There was a wind farm recently in Ontario that lost its regulatory, its environmental assessment because it would interfere with turtles that lived in the areas near where the wind farm was being built. So it really, it's not easy to simply put up a wind farm and add renewables to the grid. Generally speaking, though, a bit like the fracking issue, it's easier in less densely populated parts of North America to build wind farms than it is in more populated areas. And it's also, fortunately, usually easier to build them in the windy parts, too, as opposed to the areas that have mediocre wind. So there will be a move, I think, and I think you'll see that increasingly, that more wind farms will be built in those areas where there are less issues around NIMBYism, around regulatory burdens, around disturbance of local communities. So I'll stop there and turn it over to our panelists. I think, Mark, you were going to begin, was it?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. And Mark is going to give a bit of a presentation with a slideshow to keep you all awake. But if you do happen to drift off partly during his talk, although I'll watch you and stare at you if you do, then Brent is going to really wake you up because he's going to show you a video. So over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. And I have to admit that I'm actually the C team here because I was originally, it was my dean who was supposed to be here. And then my colleague was going to take my dean's place, and then my colleague got sick. So
we arranged for both of those diseases.
yes. So I'm going to engage in a little bit of reuse, but I think it picks up on some themes that Ross was touching on. I'll admit that this is mostly a talk I did at the University of Calgary a couple of weeks ago, but I think it connects very well because I was sort of reflecting on, in particular, Ontario's experience with renewable energy development, and in particular, some discussion about what went right and, perhaps more importantly, what went wrong. I just point out on Ostrander, the crucial point is that it was not that the wind turbines were going to cause harm to the turtles. The issue is that any access to the site of any form would have caused harm to the turtles. Rob Wright,
I'm all in favor of turtles.
Yeah, the person who was on the committee, the ERT member was very careful in writing his decision, as it was nothing about wind per se. It was about any access to that site would have caused trouble for the turtles. But now we're off to the Court of Appeal. A little context. Ontario has been through a huge upheaval in the electricity sector. We went from a vertically integrated monopoly called Ontario Hydro through a very, very aggressive experiment with a market model, with a 5-minute ahead wholesale market, which didn't work very well at all for reasons I'm not getting into today. We're now into what's termed a hybrid planning model, which in theory tries to combine components of planning and markets. It really means that there is a provincial planning agency called the Ontario Power Authority, and it contracts with private power providers to provide new supply or to refurbish supply, theoretically on a competitive basis. This was an interesting conversation in the last decade because there had been a realization that 80% of the province's generating assets, basically everything but the hydroelectric component, which was largely built before 1950, was going to hit end of life. The coal plants were on the block for phase out, mostly for health reasons, and the nuclear fleet, which made up about 60% of capacity, was all hitting end of life. And so this prompted a series of conversations about, well, do we want to rebuild the system? The green part here is the installed capacity, and the blue line is the expected growth and demand. So we had a gap. There's always gaps in electricity planning. It goes with the territory. But prompted debate about, well, should we rebuild the system the way it was? Or should we take this opportunity to do something completely different and bring in a different mix of supply? The province's answer, at least in the short term, was that we would retain a system that was 50% nuclear, but that we would start to introduce significant conservation and what they termed new renewable components over the next 20 years, along with, this one says coal phase out deferred, we got back to that eventually. In practice, a lot of the coal was replaced with natural gas, but that's another conversation for another day. The crucial piece of this to operationalize the new renewables component was this thing I mentioned in the previous talk, the Green Energy and Green Economy Act, and it basically had three crucial components for renewables. One is to provide for the feed-in tariff system, which basically pays anybody who builds a wind turbine and gets a contract with the power authority a fixed price for any energy they generate, guarantees them a market, so it removes a lot of the economic risk, provided them to a certain degree a guarantee of grid connection, although that turned out to be a lot more complex than anybody had ever realized, and it also introduced a one-window approval process, something called a renewable energy approval. In practice, what that did was it cut the municipalities out of the approval process for renewable energy projects. So you got a provincial approval, you did not have to get a municipal planning approval, and this was basically a response to local objections to renewable energy projects. Whether or not that was a wise approach, I think, is an open question to this day. Indeed, the province has reversed itself. There were multiple goals at work here, of which only one was the rapid deployment of renewable energy sources, wind, solar, PV, biogas, biomass, and small hydro, in the context of the phase out of coal, which is about 25% of the installed generating capacity, and anticipated growth in demand at about 2% a year. There was also a hope that we would develop a renewable energy manufacturing and services industry at 50,000 jobs by last year. There was a rural economic development component. There were specific parts of the program targeted at farm and Aboriginal community projects. There was a notion around community power development. There was a hope that there would be community co-ops who would uptake the feed-in tariff program, very similar to what happened in Germany and Denmark, and that would sort of introduce this element of cooperative ownership of energy generating assets, as well as the existing Crown ownership and corporate ownership. And there was also something called a microfit program. This was specifically for projects under 10 kilowatts. This is like rooftop solar on your house. In practice, it's been about 99% solar. And the idea here was partially just to get members of the public involved in energy generation and connecting them to the grid, and generally sort of raising levels of awareness and education. The renewable target went up a little bit. It's currently was around 10,700 megawatts of new renewables. By 2021 is the current target. So far, since the introduction of the Act, we now have 1,725 megawatts of wind installed, and that's from a standing start of 124 megawatts as of about 2003. This has mostly happened in the last 4 years. We've deployed about 1,600 megawatts. There's another 4,600 megawatts contracted through the FIT program, which is in the process of being installed. There are about 16,000 renewable energy contracts processed over the past 4 years through the FIT program. So this is a very, very large, significant program. As of the end of 2012, is the last numbers that we have, wind was at the stage of beginning to surpass coal as a component of the system. As you can see, it's still 56% nuclear and about 25% hydro, but there was a shift at the margin around gas, coal, and wind. The bad news is that since over the last year, the province has been in something of a retreat from the green energy program, and particularly the FIT program. The FIT for large projects over 500 kilowatts was terminated last June. There was also an agreement with Samsung, which allowed for another 2,500 megawatts, which was basically cut in half. And there were also domestic content requirements under the program that if you got a FIT contract, a certain minimum portion of the capital cost of your project, in fact, down to specific components of the project, had to be Ontario sourced, something which caused some upset at the World Trade Organization, and that component of the program no longer exists as of last December. Oops, slightly different. So sort of looking back at where we are, I'm just going to go through what seemed to me to have sort of been the key barriers and places where things went wrong, and some of these are not at all unique to Ontario, and then to make some observations about going forward, if one is wanting to do a large-scale renewable development project or program, what one might want to think about. There was a very, very significant debate about costs. In some ways, I think this may have been one of the two fatal components, the arguments about costs, and then also this other question of social conflict around facility siting and specifically around siting wind turbines. On the cost side, I don't know how well you can see this, we were in a situation where the wholesale electricity price, and we have a semi-competitive wholesale electricity market in Ontario, for the last few years had kind of crashed, was hovering somewhere around 2 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. And people immediately pointed out, well, the FIT program provided prices per kilowatt of 14 cents per kilowatt hour for wind. In some cases, solar was up to 80 cents a kilowatt hour. And they said, what in heaven's name is going on here? And that was about the extent of the public conversation. The subtleties that the market price shown here in the green, in the blue line, bore absolutely no relationship to the actual cost of providing new supply in Ontario, got lost in the conversation. That number of 2 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour is driven by historical hydroelectric assets whose costs were retired decades ago, or by the operating costs of nuclear assets whose capital costs and debts were stranded a few years ago. So it's not really in any sense a reflection of what the real capital cost of new supply looks like. That subtlety was lost in the conversation. Indeed, as Ross was hinting at, if you actually do the math, it's starting to get towards grid parity, certainly for wind, and so in other words, comparable to the cost of conventional sources of supply, particularly, and this was an interesting dimension of the debate, was that you had people pointing out, well, the province is paying way too much for supply it doesn't need, and came up with analyses that basically said that this was going to lead to an economic apocalypse. You had other people coming back and saying other analysis that said, well, no, if you take into account the capital cost, the real cost of new supply, be it gas, be it nuclear, be it something else, the difference is a lot less. And if you actually model the behavior of the renewables in the system, it's a lot less catastrophic. And indeed, if you take some moderate accounting for the avoided externalities from the renewables, what you get in terms of real cost is basically a wash. But that subtlety disappeared into the ether. And there were some genuine problems with the program design. Fundamentally, the rate structure that was originally set up for the program was designed around the needs of community-based developers. There was this notion that we would have something happen like what happened in Germany and Denmark, where you had agricultural and community cooperatives developing renewable energy projects. In practice, it turned out in Ontario, we don't have that kind of infrastructure for social enterprise, with the result that the program ended up dominated by commercial developers who didn't need 14 cents per kilowatt hour to be viable. They were viable at 8 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. There were also other more subtle programs. There was no, in Europe, there were things called digression rates incorporated, basically that the rates you're paid under the FIT program go down over time to account for improving technologies. There were links between the market prices and the rates for the FIT program. There were linkages between the price you got under the FIT program and the pace of development, that if you're getting too much development, the price went down. If you weren't getting enough, the price went up. All of these subtleties were lost in the design of the Ontario program. Second major problem, and this caught many people by surprise, was the extent of the social conflicts that emerged around wind energy development, specifically in Ontario. We seem to be somewhat unique in the sense of the strength of the opposition that emerged, and it is extremely well organized. There are debates about how much impact it had in the last provincial election. Certainly some people take the view that it cost the government its majority. I have seen some analyses which suggest that is perhaps an overstatement of the situation, but this very, very definitely has been a very serious area of conflict. What has been emerging, and Ross hinted at this, is we've been working through the fights through the renewable energy approval process and through the body called the Environmental Review Tribunal, which is essentially the appellate body for these approvals, what is happening is that the health and biophysical impact arguments are mostly falling apart. The tribunal is basically at a stage now where it's rejecting the health arguments. This is based on the study in the UK. There's been one from Massachusetts. There's one from California. Our own medical officer of health did a study that basically said, well, the health impact doesn't hold water. The wildlife impact, except for some very site-specific things, again, is not catastrophic. Where we're sort of getting to is a kind of conclusion. This is really about landscapes and aesthetics, which is helpful in the sense that it clarifies what the debate is really about. And it does tell us we're back into a land use planning conversation fundamentally, but it's been a very, very messy and ugly process, to put it mildly, to get there and to sort of understand that at the end of the day is what the conflict is about, and that's what we're trying to manage. A further complication, again, this is not unique to Ontario. It's happening all over the United States and Western Europe. And this is one of the things that I think was referred to as an inflection point in the utility business, is that electricity demand has not been going up as per the assumptions. It is going down, and it's been going down for some time. In Ontario, it's been negative now for it's coming up on nearly a decade, and the projections are now that we're looking at a flat line or slightly negative going out at least to 2020, if not beyond. Now, interestingly, GDP is going up. So we're in a circumstance of decoupling. The problem, though, is that the planners were operating on an assumption of perpetual growth and demand, which means we're at a risk of overbuild. And indeed, when you look in Ontario, it's very, very stark. This is a little chart that was done by the Ontario Power Authority. These columns basically are showing you this existing and contracted supply, and the little purple bit at the top is refurbishments of nuclear plants. There's a green line, it's a little faint here. It's the bottom of what they label as the low demand scenario, which actually cuts right through the rationale for one of the major nuclear refurbishments. Fundamentally, what's going on here is competition among different technologies for pieces of what's left of the demand pie. And at the moment, it's looking as if renewables are at risk of being thrown over the side in favor of the nuclear refurbishments, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. So this is another complication that one of the fundamental assumptions the utility operators have made for the last century within the OECD is collapsing. And that's having impacts on their viability as operations. This is what we mean by one of the inflection points. They built on assumptions that demand was going to behave in certain ways, and now demand is not behaving in certain ways. It's going down, not up. There are other complications too. A lot of them invested in gas, and now we're getting a lot of solar capacity built. The gas was designed specifically to deal with peaks in demand, which in places like Germany, they've now built so much solar, there's not really a problem meeting summer afternoon peaks anymore. So all that gas that was built as a generator isn't any use anymore, which has a profound effect on their viability as enterprises. There was considerable institutional resistance. This was a highly politicized exercise. In many ways, the Green Energy Act was seen as a rejection of the policy advice and plan which had been provided by the institutional players in the province's electricity system, principally this body called the Ontario Power Authority, but Hydro One Networks, which essentially runs the large-scale transmission infrastructure, wasn't pleased, and the independent electricity system operator, which is essentially the market operator, the people who true up demand and supply on a sort of instantaneous basis at the grid level, were not very pleased at all. In practice, there were also problems around just implementation challenges, that the scale of the program and the response was larger than the institutional players had anticipated. The Power Authority had enormous difficulty just coping with the load of moving 16,000 contracts through the system, each of which had to be subject to something called a economic connection test. Did it make sense to connect the project to the grid economically? There was a large problem at the local level in terms of actually physically connecting these renewable energy projects to the grid, which mostly had to be done by what we call in Ontario a local distribution company. The way the electricity system is structured in urban areas and towns, there are local, usually municipally owned utilities who basically take the electricity from the provincial level grid and distribute it down to people's houses. They were given the job of connecting the renewable projects. Nobody had figured out who was going to pay for that work. Was it going to be paid for at the provincial level? Were the LDCs going to have to pay for that? And whose rate base was this going to come off? There were also issues around the grid operator in terms of their capacity to manage these increasing amounts of intermittent resources. So they say now that's largely resolved, that they've now got their forecasting for wind and for solar in pretty good shape, and they have a pretty good sense of what they will be dealing with day to day and hour to hour. They actually transferred the projection work from the individual operators of renewable facilities to the IESO itself. So it handles the forecasting, and they are now feeling pretty comfortable with their ability to forecast what's going to happen on the renewable side, and therefore what are they going to need in terms of what they call dispatchable resources, things that can be run up and down to respond to demand. As an economic development strategy, this has not worked out very well. There are not 50,000 jobs. Indeed, the number that's floated around has been about 2,000 jobs in direct employment. Our sort of comment on this, we did a paper on this. The Mowat Center did a paper on this, which is the research center at U of T. And in both cases, I think the basic answer was the problem with this as an economic development strategy is they forgot the strategy part. There was no strategy for developing the renewable energy sector. We had a few ad hoc measures, the local content piece, the deal with Samsung, which was supposed to bring manufacturing capacity into Ontario, but there was no sectoral strategy for the development of the sector in the province. I think that's a major problem. The second big problem was, although the IESO has had some success, we were very, very late in thinking about how do we use smart grids and smart grid capacities to facilitate integration of intermittent renewables. How do you deal with wind when the wind doesn't blow? How do you deal with solar when the sun doesn't shine? And similarly, it's only been in the last few months that we've seen a strategy around energy storage technologies start to emerge, which again is crucial if you're integrating intermittent renewables on a large scale. Because the ISO is saying, up to the level that we've gone so far, we're able to manage this without any great difficulty. But if we start going to higher levels of penetration, then we're going to have to become more sophisticated, and we're going to need storage capacity in the system, which is only just beginning to come together. Very interesting technological developments. It's very interesting conversations potentially emerging with Quebec about their storage capacity, because Quebec has lots of hydro dams with lots of reservoirs, which is exactly what you need if you're trying to balance out intermittent renewables. Ontario, although it has quite a lot of hydro, most of it has very little actual storage. It's mostly run-of-river. Niagara is the only place we have particularly large amounts of storage, and that's only designed to be overnight. So, some final thoughts. If you were designing a renewable energy program from the ground up and want to take some lessons away from our experience, this is what I would suggest. If you're going to do a FIT program, focus it on community, farm, Aboriginal-based developers, not commercial developers. And you're going to have to provide support to them. The institutional capacity to do what the agricultural and community cooperatives did in Denmark and Germany, it doesn't exist in Ontario. I don't know if it exists in Southern Ohio or Michigan or in Quebec. But you need to deal with that. And in particular, what emerged as a serious, serious barrier was the issues around financing and the ability of cooperatives to collateralize the financing, to be able to get the upfront money to run the project. Commercial developers probably need to be dealt with through some sort of a competitive request for proposal type program. Essentially what we did in the early stages of renewable energy development in Ontario. They can cope with that, they can cope with the risks, and you definitely get lower prices as a result. We need to do a better job of integrating renewables development and land use planning. And we understand these conflicts are fundamentally about landscapes and about different competing land uses, the health stuff and the other things are going to fall in a way. It still means we have to figure out a way to deal with those conflicts and manage them. You have to have the institutional capacity to deal with the contracting, to implement the connections as the program rolls out. And then crucially, you need to be moving on the storage side and on the smart grid side to support the integration of renewable resources up to their full potential. There is increasing concern in Ontario that we may end up stranding some of the renewable assets that we've contracted because we don't have the grid integration and storage capacity to be able to utilize them fully. We end up using resources like gas, which are much more expensive and much more polluting as a result. So that's my 2 cents. The third cent, we've actually a piece in the journal Energy Policy on all of this in the current issue, actually, by myself and one of my PhD students. Energy, Economic, and Environmental Discourses and Their Impact, the Case of Ontario's Green Energy and Green Economy Act. So, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was great, and I think the lessons in Ontario's plan are being observed in other jurisdictions. Certainly, GE has looked at them very carefully, and I think some of the points that you make, particularly around community engagement and are directly applicable to what is happening in jurisdictions in the U.S. and in Europe. So on that theme, we have Brent, who is going to give us a little bit more more of a deep dive into the whole issue of community energy plans.
Find the right one, folks. There we go. I think what Mark also touched on, and just in terms of lessons learned that are useful for people, is the Nova Scotia copied Ontario. Not directly, but pretty close on their FIT program. And they've been doing quite the deep dive as well of analysis of what was working, what's not. And what's really interesting about...
Can I get closer to that mic?
Is that working better now for you?
Yes.
Excellent. What's really interesting is that they truly are islanded, in the sense of that they are very dependent on what they can produce within their own confines on Nova Scotia. And renewables was quite a dominant approach, where wind has gone quite well. But they're at a different situation. And they're starting to see the same situation in terms of pricing come up now, in terms of 40% of their energy is moving towards renewables. What they also have to now add into their pricing is the addition of Muskrat Falls. Which is getting very interesting as well, which is just in Newfoundland. So we're starting to see this whole conversation. This morning, it was raised about the interconnections between the United States and Canada along the eastern seaboard and how much of a challenge that is. It's being driven through all the work that's going on in Newfoundland right now. And so if you wanted, that's a good area to take a look at, just in terms of some of the cross-border situational analysis that's being done to address this, and how that's going to get into Vermont and further down to New York State, is fundamentally important for those states to also hit their goals. So this is an interesting situation that hasn't got a lot of attention, so I just thought I'd raise that just for curiosity. 4 things, just a little bit about QUEST, Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow. As Ross mentioned, it's a small group, but it's mighty. We have 7 caucuses. They're not political caucuses. They're industry volunteers. There's 700 people who engage with QUEST across Canada to try and understand how to advance smart energy communities. And we specifically work with 3 audiences: municipalities, utilities, and the real estate sector, specifically the developer. And the reason we chose those 3 audiences is because what we consider, they're the implementer at the end of the day. They're the ones building out your systems that you see in communities both across Canada and the United States. On that note, though, I want to put in context what's happening. One of the key things that's starting to change here in Canada and across the United States is what Mark was referencing, is there's an evolution in how we think about grids, gas and electricity. And it's happening faster than most of us had fathomed or could believe. Germany is a little bit of an insight into this. Going well, this will work.
Canada is made up of over 5,000 communities.
These communities account for 61% of energy use and more than half of all greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. Herein lies an opportunity. Let's make our communities into smart energy communities. In so doing, improve energy efficiency, cut costs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So what does a smart energy community look like? First, conventional energy networks get integrated. That means that the electricity, natural gas, district energy, and transportation fuel networks in a community are better coordinated to match energy needs with the most efficient energy source. When conventional energy networks are integrated, it opens the door to innovations like alternative fuel vehicles, energy storage, waste heat capture, and combined heat and power. Second, a smart energy community considers land use, recognizing that poor land use decisions can equal a whole lot of energy waste. Third, a smart energy community harnesses local energy opportunities. These can be stock opportunities like solar, wind, and geothermal, or they can be opportunities that are tailored to a community, like water source cooling, sewage heat capture, biomass for heating, and capturing biogases for electricity and transportation fuel. Every community will have its own unique mix of local energy opportunities. Together, they can achieve significant energy efficiency improvements. Integrating conventional energy networks, making smart land use decisions, harnessing local energy opportunities. West, advancing smart energy communities in Canada.
I played that largely so that we could get a better sense of what's happening in communities in real time, both in Canada and the United States. These conversations that we're getting into as they relate to the different types of systems being built, from energy storage, from photovoltaics to electric vehicles, it's happening. And so give me a sec, I'll just get back to the presentation. The title of our presentation included the word conflict. There is a conflict. That conflict is our grid was not established to accommodate these types of alternative electricity options we're starting to see, as well as on the thermal side. This is something that we're going to have to start to resolve, and the conversation we're starting to have now is about integration. And it seems like a loaded term, but it's actually extremely complex. Ontario is a great example of what it means when you try and introduce a feed-in tariff process. And what does that mean about how you bring all these systems on board? What Mark and I did highlight in various conversations, really important, is he mentioned about wind in certain parts of Ontario where they thought they were going to put it. It doesn't work so well because they didn't improve the grid. You can't put the load on. So where it looks good to put the wind, you can't actually feed it in. So we have these yellow zones in Ontario that you can't move stuff through very easily because they're constrained. And that's an important term we're starting to use a lot. That term constrained sounds very legal. It is, because you're starting to see that conversation pop up everywhere in the United States. It's constrained about where you move and how you move energy. And this is getting interesting for a lot of people. The energy system in the United States, I want to show a bit of an evolution. It was designed to really handle large generation and connect to a large number of consumers. There's about 1,000 gigawatts of generation that's being produced in the United States now on one end, and on the other end, what we're really starting to see is just the homeowner. We started talking about that a little earlier, and industry as well. What connects all of this, most of us are familiar with it, is electricity through poles and wires. The electricity, though, for the most part, flows in one direction. That's the challenge. That's what's changing. We're starting to see electricity pop up all throughout a community. And how you bring these pieces together and distribute them when you need them is becoming quite a complex conversation, both from an engineering, but also from the legal side as well. So where we came from, very conventional practice in terms of where power would flow. It's not something that utilities now in the United States and Canada consider to be their reality. Most utilities recognize that this model that we've got now will not last for much longer. It's very interesting, and on Canada, there was a study that's just come out from the Canadian Electricity Association, where they have underscored is that most of the base load for energy in Canada is produced through our heritage hydroelectric systems, 61 to 64%. The remaining part to get up to 100% is now open for discussion. They're not sure what the future is going to look like. We're betting on things like natural gas. We're also looking at activities as photovoltaics and wind. But the combination of all of this is very much different from what was only discussed 5 years ago. What's really starting to, though, emerge is a different way of thinking about the alternative electricity system. What this particular graph is showing to you right now is that in 2012, on the far right-hand side, you're looking at 10 gigawatts growth of photovoltaics in the United States. Only 2% of the total energy needed in the actual country. At the same side of that, you're seeing Germany, which we reference in terms of their growth and what's happening. In less than really 8 or 9 years, they've moved to making 20% of their entire baseload photovoltaics. That's a really short timeline for a change. What's happening in the United States, and what utilities have all decided is happening, is they're on the same track. So they're expecting to see in less than 8 to 10 years a completely different distribution system. That, I think, is a fundamental change in terms of how we might think about the flow and movement of energy. But it's not just Germany. We're seeing high penetration of distributed PV in California, whether it's Arizona or Hawaii. Hawaii actually in the same situation, extremely significant amount of growth. You got the same thing as Ross mentioned, countries in Italy, Spain, Japan, Australia. They're all starting to move to more forms of distributed power. We're also seeing quite the growth here in the United States and Canada of natural gas in terms of its use for generation of electricity for a variety of reasons. But you're also getting, and we heard the term combined heat and power. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. Most universities work on that, where you have a central boiler system, where it moves the heat out to various buildings through pipes. You can also get cooling, so it can do air conditioning, but you can also generate power. So, for instance, most universities have all three, and hence they are actually able to operate, and we talked about it when there are outages in certain areas, they can generate their own power, as well as heating and cooling. This is really starting to take off in quite a few different areas. In Canada on the municipal side, and on the United States side, it's interesting, it's more private sector. Is really advancing quite extensively on CHP systems behind the meter. And that's something else I'm going to get into. We're starting to see more and more people move off-grid, not because they want to be on their own and they're green. They don't want to have to start paying the prices they're seeing for electricity and or potentially for other types of gas. So what we're starting to see is more of a model like this, where we're seeing the use of smart meters. You've heard a lot of discussion on the use of that across the United States and Canada to help advance with two things. We heard about the social aspect side, about getting people to conserve, but it's also time of use pricing. Smart meters are also for data collection, so you can better plan and think about the distribution system. One of the underlying aspects, though, of all of this is that the future is coming pretty quickly, both in Canada and the US. What we're increasingly starting to see is more and more consumers, this as an example, who want to do both generation, smart grid, and they're introducing combined heat and power all at once in a local neighborhood. And that throws a distribution system into a bit of chaos. It wasn't planned that way. And so what we're starting to see, and the concern is stranded assets. Utilities both in California and New York Power are very concerned about that. They're starting to see more and more of the situation that they'll have losses. Where it gets into a different conversation is how do you pay for those losses? And so our regulatory system hasn't actually addressed that question yet. And that's starting to come forward both right across the United States and in Canada, depending on which regulator and which area. So what we're starting to see more of is a system that's moving in this direction, where you're seeing homes that are completely integrated and connected. You're seeing the application of demand response. Electric vehicle charging is starting to really take off in certain areas as the growth of electric vehicles continues. You have energy storage, as Mark mentioned, is becoming more prominent in the planning process for communities. All of this is just changing the system. So where we headed is towards more of an integrated grid. We'll use the term system. The modernization of the grid has to take place, though, to take on board more of these sources of energy generation. This isn't just a US or Canadian phenomenon, it's global, and it's happening depending where you are, in certain cases much faster than in others. The challenge, though, for the most part, is our policy and regulatory framework is missing for it. Particularly in Canada, the number one discussion that utilities cannot and are having a real challenge with is getting permission for innovation to put on the rate-based side. It's a bit different here depending where you are in the United States, but that's an issue where you're trying to expand and incorporate new technologies which are already available. Not to put a plug in, but GE is a good example of your smart grid demonstration and innovation center in Markham, Ontario, where they're starting to produce more and more applications to help harness the integration of the grid. The interesting part, they get more international walkthrough than they do Canadian walkthrough, because we haven't been able to get permission to experiment and understand how to start to evolve the grid, which is already happening in the US and particularly in Europe. The real benefit, though, from an integrated grid is the fact that you will have to incorporate it into the planning and operation of the system, just like we do with larger scale generation and transmission. Mark noted on this is that how this is happening is we're starting to see a different process emerge, both more locally, largely through the term community energy planning. Now, community energy planning is really about the importance of connecting supply and end use. We heard a little bit of discussion about end use. That's transportation, water, wastewater, buildings, both heating, cooling, and power, and how you actually move that into a way that you can strategize. Land use planning, I know it seems strange for a conversation in electricity and thermal energy, but once you go to put a building here and you decide how people are going to move between where they're employed in that building, you've actually created the energy profile. You can't change it very easily. They're going to get in a car and they're going to drive, and that uses so much energy. That building, when it's built, is built to a standard, and it's going to use so much electricity as well as heating, thermal. Where you can integrate and actually have a bigger conversation is before you build it. United States, Canada, many other cities are starting to go through significant redevelopment projects, and the time is actually paramount for a lot of infrastructure upgrades. The example that I give you that we often don't think about, and I just want to underscore here, waste energy. A very simple application of sewer heat. It's free. We've built the infrastructure for it. The Olympic Village in Vancouver that has 50,000 people heats itself. 70% of its heat comes from the sewer heat from those 50,000 people. I know it sounds strange to us, but we're starting to see more of this thinking about how do you harness local, because it's more cost effective in some cases, but it's also just more pragmatic when you start looking at the longer term, full life cycle costs of infrastructure. It's costly to build. So why not think about how to harness those systems already that you're going to have to build one way or the other, which is sewer, water, etc. We heard 80% in New York State. It's some cases higher for the amount of cost of energy that's spent on pumping and treating water. On average, it's 60% or more of municipal budgets on electricity right across the United States and Canada is spent just on the treating and pumping of water. It's not something we think about, but there's ways to do that better. So community energy planning is really a process to help people start to think about their role in energy. What are the options that are at the community level? And in some cases, how do you link in with either your state or provincial planning energy process? That's where things are changing. It's this new interconnection point that people hadn't thought about, not from an engineering standpoint, it's social, it's people. People are saying, I have a thought on this because energy is important to me now in my community. And the role of community energy planning is not well developed yet in the United States. You're seeing a few communities with examples of that, but what we're really starting to see is a takeoff in Canada. Northwest Territories, every community there has a community energy plan. Mark mentioned BC, every community there also has a community energy plan. Where they're all struggling on them is implementation. Why? Because our systems have not been set up yet to allow for these conversations to occur and to understand how you take the physical engineering science of electricity planning and plug it in with people's interests and needs. They kind of hit each other fairly hard. And this is where we're starting to change. A good example of this, though, and when we get into community energy planning, and you referenced the city of Guelph, they did an amazing job. They took about 6 years to get through their planning process and understanding what they're going to do. And I put a little example up here because the city itself didn't see its role as having to implement and build a plan. It saw its role as the conductor, which is what cities are really good at. They're about getting people together and understanding how to mobilize and implement on a plan and who needs to be brought in to deliver on it. Because the plan, community energy planning, isn't delivered itself. Utilities have their own plan. Municipalities usually have their own plan. It's how do you put these two together? This is where the role of engagement is coming front and center. So just as an example, these are all the various agencies, sectors, or groups that were brought into the conversation for the city of Guelph. That they really wanted to achieve, and their goal was a 50% reduction per capita in greenhouse gas emissions and 60% overall in energy per capita. Are they en route? Yes. Is it a long-term process? Yes. Why? Because transportation is really tough. You can't get people out of cars too easily. You're fuel switching for the most part. The other part of this is buildings or building other types of generation. What happened in this community is they got enough knowledge to know that building a big central plant nearby may not meet their interests. And they articulated with a plan. A plan is pretty powerful because they could show their vision against the province's vision, and the two didn't line up. So what it led to was conflict. Conflict in the understanding about how they were going to actually work together and harmonize these plans, and a political issue, front and center. Because you had a province who wanted to advance a particular plan, and you have a municipality who didn't like that relative to what they thought was important for them. They're not the only ones. There was enough communities in that area who started to do one that they could also voice their need and what they thought was important. So what was the outcome of this, and why engagement is changing, is that now they're moving from a regional energy planning, they're moving to a regional energy planning strategy in Ontario, which means people are becoming involved. Their understanding of their plans are becoming involved as well. What does that lead to, potentially? It's a slightly different looking grid structure. I'm not just voicing Quest's perspective here. These slides, I'm really happy to say, came from the collaboration of utilities across Canada and their own understanding of what's going on. Their concern is that the policymakers and the regulators are not up to speed with where their customers or consumers already at and is asking of them. So we're starting to see these tensions both in Canada and the United States more and more. They want to respond. This is happening. We're not quite there yet. Engagement, utilities realize, is a way to get people on board, all sides on board, and up to faster speed. Thanks very much.
Good. Well, I think we have a few minutes for questions. That was really very interesting, Brent. Thanks a lot, and Mark as well. Because I think it really brings home the fact that for the adoption of renewables and for changing the way we distribute energy, you need a combination of legislation, you need the right regulatory environment, and then you need this community engagement. I'm wondering if anyone has a question right away. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, could you, there was no mention of nuclear. What is the cost if we were to start from scratch to put nuclear in as opposed to wind and solar?
That's a highly contested issue. For new build, you'll get figures anything from 8 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. I would personally tend towards the upper end of that range, in the 15 to 20 cents.
So wind is cheaper outright than nuclear
Yes,
today?
it's certainly comparable, I would argue, at least, possibly better. You have to take into account the problem of intermittency with wind. But there's also then on the other side a range of externalities associated with nuclear that you would have to manage: waste fuel, decommissioning, upstream impacts as well. Refurbishments, which are what's on the table in Ontario more, and for a lot of utilities, are much more uncertain, because sometimes you're taking 40-year-old piece of equipment And you find, what we found in Ontario when we tried to do that is you find things that you didn't expect when you start to take it apart. And so that's been subject to fairly massive overruns and delays. And so the estimates in the energy policy paper, we actually published them. The estimates for refurbished nuclear in Ontario literally run, with some degree of substantiation behind them, run from 8 cents a kilowatt hour to 37 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on whose estimates you want to believe. So it's a tough one.
There must be good estimates coming out of Europe, such as.
They haven't refurbished that much, but for the new builds, again, where they've landed, remember, there's only the one actual project underway, which is in Finland so far, of an actual new build in the modern age. And Siemens walked away from it for $1. It tells you something about how well it was going. So that's where Standard & Poor's are coming up with numbers in the 14, 15 plus cents per kilowatt hour kind of range, as that's their current numbers that they're floating around. So, I mean, it's highly contested. You know, there's different sources arrive at different conclusions. That seems to be where it's floating reasonably.
So Ontario made a good decision to get rid of their nuclear.
Well, certainly well, remember,
Stand on it.
yeah, remember, we made a decision not to proceed with new build,
Right.
which, because there's just no case, the demand is not there. And the province discovered on the first pass, it underestimated the cost by a factor of 3.7 times. You know, the original estimate was,
Oops.
yeah. The refurbishments are still part of the plan at the moment, and this is where a big chunk of the conversation is now going, is given the cost risk, and we've actually even had in Ontario, we had 2 of the attempted refurbishments on the first round, we actually had to abandon and write off, that they discovered halfway through they couldn't get through it. And so there's now a debate, should we refurbish both the Darlington plant, which is about 3,200 megawatts, and Bruce, another 6 reactors, which is over 6,000. Does that make sense economically versus more renewables, hydroelectric imports from Quebec, range of other possibilities? That's really where the conversation now sits in Ontario.
Right. The other Jim.
Yes, a little history. 34 years ago, I sponsored the Wind Energy Systems Act in the U.S. Congress. Norman Mineta and Jim Jeffers were co-sponsors, and we actually got it through. And President Carter signed it. This is 34 years ago. And they gave a subsidy to wind. By that time, the prime mover behind the scenes, by the way, was Boeing. We got it through. It offered subsidies. We pushed it because we wanted to diversify energy supply. It was cleaner. It was popular with my political base, the Democrats. And we just finished going through the Arab oil embargo, and so it was, looking for renewables was really important. President Reagan came in. We were in a global recession. I wouldn't blame Reagan for that. The price of oil dropped, and he let all those renewable programs expire because we don't need it anymore. We now have a new reason for renewables. It isn't just diversifying. It's now we're conscious about climate change and the air quality issues. We're much more sensitive today for that than we were 34 years ago. So there's another reason for it. The big issue, though, as you've touched on, is storage. I'm on the board of a company that is oil and gas pipeline, but we also have solar photovoltaic, and we have 10 wind farms. And by the way, I warned our executives you're going to have local opposition, which they have in a lot of places. But it's still storage, 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 all right? And we don't have dams everywhere or places for reservoirs. We don't have that. You have that more in Canada or, say, in Quebec. But it is a huge issue, and until we figure out how to store electricity other than just dams and reservoirs, we are up against a wall. Leave aside the local opposition. By the way, in Pentwater, Michigan, where I have a cottage, nearby there is
You don't want one.
a wind farm. There is a wind farm there, and people are absolutely insisting they can hear the noise at night and can't sleep. So there are lawsuits and everything. The young people in the area, including my son, think it's a beautiful work of art to see the wind farm, but the old folks don't like it. But it's still down to storage. So would you develop that issue a little better for us? Because that's the key for these renewables. And we haven't had a whole lot of advancement in 34 years.
Right. I mean, the whole issue around renewables is, part of a flexible energy system, so that you have base load from hydro or nuclear, you have gas plants that can deal with peak needs, and then you have renewables. And what the challenge is to get the renewables closer to what that base load, how it performs. And storage is absolutely key. So there's a number of technologies that we're looking at, including various forms of battery storage. And GE, but others have made big investments in battery storage. And in fact, in Colorado, built a big sodium battery factory. So I wonder if the panelists have any
Yeah,
comment
because
on
right
that.
now, I see it as we need natural gas is a foundation fuel, and then all the other renewables you use when they're working and when you're at peak. But otherwise, you've got to have a foundation fuel.
So Ross and Mark and I will go back and forth on this one a little bit. Storage, we're used to think of storage through, just take a battery, Duracell or Energizer, and that's how we often think about battery storage. That is changing, and I think this will get to your point about how you get large-scale storage, which is that big stuff that you want to be able to respond to, versus also decentralized community storage, which is also on the table now. And so there are a multitude of companies coming up with innovations, but let's just take two examples on large scale. You got compressed air that's becoming more and more thought about. You're thinking, how do you use that? Mines, abandoned mines being thought about. You fill them with compressed air when they're being charged up, and then you can release that air as well in terms of thought of storage. This is just the way to think differently about the idea of storage. The other part we haven't thought about are grids. The natural gas grid is huge, right? Massive, both across Canada and the United States. What people are now thinking about is you can take wind energy, of course, you can convert that through a hydroelectric process to create hydrogen. You could take that hydrogen, which is a derivative, of course, for natural gas, and guess where you can stick it? In the grid. Now,
In the gas
grid, natural gas grid. It takes some time to figure out how you might be able to actually do that and what that's going to look like. And it's going to be quite the challenge. But going forward, it could be quite the valuable opportunity that needs to be further explored. That's just two very large ones that are just being thought about now. On the community scale, though, storage has also changed. I'll just give you an example. Toronto Hydro did not get permission to increase its delivery charge to start to upgrade its infrastructure. And it's really old infrastructure, 100 years old, starting to really fall apart in certain areas. That is a real issue. They wanted more money, of course, to do more things with that grid, to get it up to a certain standard. But what they are experimenting with, and they got permission to do, was to literally build community-based power storage in certain parts where the infrastructure is degraded to help create better balance in the system. And I think that's where you're going to see a lot of utilities start to play around too, because there's two different philosophies we're talking about too. There's central, larger scale, and then we also have this whole aspect of smaller scale, decentralized happening in communities as well. So the complexity of storage is not just building storage, it's what scale storage do you need for when too, is the other part of the equation. I'll turn it back.
Well, the Germans and the Danes especially are going down the gas path for storage. I mean, they're looking at very large scale integration of renewables, and that's very clearly where they're heading, because they see the existing, both the grid infrastructure, storage infrastructure, and conversion technologies that can work for that purpose. So that seems to be where they're at. Batteries are becoming less and less part of the conversation. There's interesting stuff going on about electric cars, and there are various proposals floating around. We're going to have a lot of high quality batteries that aren't quite good enough to run your Tesla anymore, but still work really well. And so there's an emerging secondary market for old car, like the electric car scale batteries as a storage medium. There's thermal storage, which again is common in Europe. You heat up water, and you use the water for heating. You have a tank at a facility, and Markham District Energy does this too, and it works if you have a district energy system, a district heating and hot water system. There's all sorts of neat stuff going on with flywheels, of all things. Like there's a huge technological leap that's happening. The flywheels are used more for evening out the output as opposed to long-term storage. And then in Ontario, we have a very unique situation, which is our relationship with our neighbor Quebec and its relationship with its traditional customers. Because one of the consequences of the fracking boom south of the border is that Hydro-Quebec is being displaced as the marginal source of supply by natural gas-fired electricity south of the border, with the result that their marginal price is crashing. So if there was ever a time for Ontario and Quebec to have a conversation, this would be it, because Quebec has exactly the kind of storage that Ontario needs. The environmental costs are essentially sunk. The questions of relations with Aboriginal people are resolved. It's just a question of can we ever manage that conversation. So it is an area where there's a huge amount of progress happening. We're not fully there, but the possibilities are looking much more diverse and much more interesting and much more grid scale than they did even a decade ago. So we're getting there, and this is part of what's got the conventional utilities a little nervous, because if you can crack the storage and dispatchability question,
That's it.
you're into a different game. It's a different game.
Different game.
David, do we have time for one last question from Michael Robinson? A question.
I like to learn new stuff about Canada all the time, I know. Okay, you just mentioned interprovincial conversations. I think it's useful to recognize, and Jim Peterson understands this, that since he was the chief negotiator for Ontario in a form of agreement on internal trade with Quebec, which is a bit of a joke, kind of like the one that we have for the rest of Canada called the Agreement on Internal Trade. There is no energy chapter. Even though it was signed in 1999, they can't agree on one. And we can also recognize that we have a constitutional problem in Canada, which they don't have in the US, I don't think anyway. And it's illustrated by the classic case of Newfoundland and Quebec and Churchill Falls, the so-called Upper Churchill, the great dam of over 5,000 meg. In any event, Canadians know that poor old Premier of Newfoundland over 30 years ago got totally snookered by Quebec, but conned him into an agreement to allow the power to go through Quebec for peanuts. We're now building Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland, actually in Labrador, and using an absolute Rube Goldberg system to run wires under 2 seas to get it from Newfoundland to Labrador, Labrador to Nova Scotia, and then to those nice markets in Boston and New York. Why? Because the Canadian constitutional power over trade and commerce has been eviscerated by court judgments. What should have happened is the government of Canada should have said, okay, one, sit down Quebec and renegotiate that outrageous deal you made with Newfoundland under the federal trade and commerce power, and we're going to enforce that. And two, Muskrat Falls, let the line be twinned to get that power through Quebec for peanuts so that power can be exported to the US using the trade and commerce power and the power over our exports. And we can't do it, or this government won't try it.
I wrote an opinion when I was at the Department of Justice Constitutional and International Law section many years ago about just why the trade and commerce power doesn't allow that. But anyway, we won't get into a debate about some of the arcane aspects of constitutional law in Canada. because I think to be fair to our American colleagues, we would have to have a discussion about some of the problems down here too. So at that, I want to thank the panelists for, I thought, a very informative discussion about something that we hear a lot about, but I think it's quite clear not many of us know much about. And so it's always nice to have a little bit of facts behind the political debate. So thank you very much to Grant and to Mark. David, back to you.
Well, and thank you very much for a wonderful discussion. I very much look forward to the future of wind farms in my backyard and everywhere else. So I hope so. At any rate,
Not in my back.
just well, that concludes today's panel programming. Of course, we have a great reception later tonight at 6 p.m., followed by dinner and another amazing keynote by Jay Robinson West, something certainly not to miss. Tomorrow, we have our last and final panel, which is going to be an excellent one on automotive innovation, talking about some of the topics that were talked about here, things like electric vehicles, natural gas-driven vehicles. We've got a packed panel of 4 panelists and a chair, so certainly not something to miss. And have fun tonight, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. One last housekeeping measure. The advisory board, we are meeting across the hall in A65. You'll note the Canada-US